Welcome to another episode of Voice of the Church. This is the second segment in an ongoing conversation that we're having about politics and economics. I'm Bill DeYoung, a pastor at Blessings Christian Church in Hamilton, and I have with me Brian Dijkema, who's the Vice President of External Affairs at CARDUS, which is a faith-based think tank in the city of Hamilton, and he's also an economist. Nice to have you here again, Brian. And then we also have Jonathan Wellam, who is the President and CEO of Rocklinc Investment Partners, an investor. And the three of us have been talking about economics already in a previous episode, and now we want to talk more specifically about government. And Brian, I'm wondering if I could begin with you, and if you could share with us what you understand to be the purpose of government, biblically speaking.
The purpose of government is to do justice. That's its job. That's its purpose. And it's a particular type of justice. It's public justice. And public justice means giving the public what it is due, right? So that's the traditional definition of justice, is you give the person what they're owed. And that's a special, that what people are owed is unique when it comes to government, and particularly government in the state in which we are today. So I would say that the purpose of government is to execute public justice. And what does that mean? So everyone says, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that there are some basic fundamental things. It means protection of the citizens from threats. And so that's why we have, in Romans it talks about the government is given the sword for a reason. That sword is there to protect the citizens, whether from external threats or from internal threats. So you have an army and you have a police force. It's intended to create laws that enable orderly affairs within society. So we can talk about things like, for instance, the holding of the sword is to sort of restrain evil, but there's also a sense in which the doing justice or allowing people to conduct their affairs orderly is like things like driving. We talk about this before, but somebody has to decide what side of the road we're going to drive on. And that's not a response to sin. It's not like driving on the left side, as the Brits would know, is a sin, or the Aussies. But that's the sense in which the government makes that decision because it's applicable to the public as a whole, right? So there's that sense of sort of orderly conduct, production of affair, or protection of the citizens and its people, or sort of orderly rules for conducting our affairs. And there's another role of enabling. I would say there's a role for the government to enable, through proper laws, other means of human flourishing, whether that's education, whether that's economic life. Jonathan can talk a lot about the importance of good laws for ordering economic life.
Well, I'm going to interrupt you right there and go to Jonathan with that question. What is the relationship between government and economics? Brian talked about the role to protect justice and to provide justice. How does that fit in with the economic realm? What is the role of government in relation to economics?
I mean, I think in Romans 13, Paul lays out in 7 verses there some very important points in regards to government. It is to promote good and to punish evil. And as Brian has said, utilizes the sword, so it's got power, tremendous power to do it. And actually in that passage it says they're a minister of God. The government's minister of God. And Paul is writing in the context of the Roman Empire. So as much as I don't currently like our government here in Canada, it's nothing as evil and as bad as that. So, and that's because, again, in a fallen world, we need government. It is a gift from God. And so it's very important, especially in the investment area, because you need the regulations. You need to have laws, contract laws, property laws. They need to be clear. They need to be enforceable. They need to be done impartially. They need to be done consistently, or the whole system will break down. So we've been so blessed in Canada, United States, most of the Western world, by a tremendous regulatory system which keeps people in check. It's transparent. It's generally applied fairly consistently so that players know what they're in for, and then that allows us to then operate and to go out and to flourish and to make decisions and to raise capital, allocate capital, and do all the things that are necessary. But you absolutely need government in that area because men are sinners, men and women are sinners, human beings, and they will abuse it, and if the lines aren't drawn and enforced, and enforced publicly and consistently, they will be abused.
I think we're all inclined, maybe especially as Christians, to complain about the government. And it's such an important point that you're making, that government is good and government is necessary. And I think it's very interesting that one of the images that we have of Jesus is of Jesus as king. That's a description that Scripture gives us. So it's actually a government title that's assigned to the Messiah. I'm wondering if you could share with us ways in which you think the government can encourage healthy economy. I think Jonathan has begun to speak to that, but are there ways that you think that the government can stimulate economy or encourage economic endeavor?
So I'll start by going back to the role. I mean, Jonathan's alluded to the fact that it's healthy and stimulative for an economy for those who are doing wrong to be brought into line. So that's the sort of the negative side of that. But there is also a sense in which the order, the regulation, we talked about the order and regulation, but there's an enabling sense in which the government can enable the economy to flourish. And I think it does that in a variety of ways. One is it provides and protects the freedom of people to act within that space, right? So it recognizes that economic life is unique, it has unique function, businesses are unique corporate structures, institutional structures, that shouldn't be dictated to by, for instance, the church, right? There's a sense in which dictated to by, I mean this in terms of ordering the affairs. Or
I was offended.
Okay, yeah. Or the state, for that matter, right? That's the sort of the communist model, that the state was directing the affairs. So there's a sense in which the government can help the economy by protecting the proper space of the economy. That's another way to do it. That's one way to do it. Another way to do that is that it will also protect the space of the things that help an economy to thrive that aren't primarily economic. And we talked about that in the earlier one. Economies only thrive when you have honesty. Economies thrive, as our research at CARDUS shows, healthy families are good for economic outcomes. Children and raised in families are good. It's better for wealth generation, all of the rest of that stuff. So the government can help the economy indirectly by also protecting the freedom of other institutions and other spheres of life, whether it's family. Promoting public education is an important part of that. Important, labor laws, trade unions, protecting space for them to be able to interact and have freedom. So there's a sense in which it can do all of those things. I would say it also has an obligation, and we can talk about where those lines are. But if you look at Scripture and you look at the picture of the kings, and in the prophets in the Old Testament, what were the kings hammered by for the prophets? Often is for ignoring the widows, not giving justice to the widows, and ignoring the orphans. And so I do think there's a role for the state, if not directly, to enable and ensure that those who are unable for whatever reason to thrive economically are cared for economically. So there's a sort of a multiplicity of functions that are limited, and yet are still important. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's...
Yeah. So Jonathan, would you agree with that that's one of the responsibilities that the government has in relation to economy, to ensure that those who are deprived of income are cared for?
Yeah, I'd be careful going down that road in terms of how far you want to go. I think that it would be much better if that was done in the private sector. It was much better if it was done through Christian organizations and institutions, similar to what it was done in Canada prior to 50, 60 years ago, when you had the introduction of the socialism within their own country. Having said that, if that's not being done and it's not being picked up, then I think that is a spot where government can be helpful and certainly encourage it, whether it's through tax incentives and so forth. We should, so that people aren't falling between the cracks. So it's going to depend on the influence of Christianity in that culture and how charitable people are in terms of how they're going to be taken care of. If you look in the situation here in Ontario, very traditionally a prosperous province, now not as prosperous. We have the largest debt, sub-sovereign debt in the world. It's, we're living far beyond our means. We have a healthcare system that people think that they're entitled to at all costs, despite the fact that we can't pay for it. And that starts to bring together this tension that should the state have gotten 100% involved in the medical system, and can it really provide for it when it doesn't manage it properly? And what are the implications of that long term in terms of our economy? So it raises, what I'd say overall is the government should be concerned about that, absolutely, but how it is effectively worked out can take different forms. And I think ultimately as Christians, we should be concerned, absolutely concerned, in using our institutions and using corporations and using the free market to provide those things. The same with education. You do not want government monopolies in education, which is what we have, to a certain degree in many parts of our country. You want vouchers, you want competitive educational systems, but the government ensuring that they are all operating and flourishing so that we do have universal education, we do have universal literacy. So again, it's in how it's worked out that I think we want to be careful.
Abraham Kuyper, who was a Dutch politician and the Prime Minister of the Netherlands in the early 20th century, said that the state should not be the diaconate of the church. And I think it's this idea that Jonathan is recommending. You talked about the responsibility that the government has, but imagine a scenario where the gospel is flourishing in Canada, churches are multiplying, and Christians are very active in caring for those who are sick and needy. Would you say in that scenario that the government can withdraw from that realm of, let's say, healthcare if Christians are establishing hospitals and ensuring that people are cared for?
So let me clarify, or let me reiterate what I actually said.
Okay.
I never said that the government should do all those things themselves. I said the government was responsible to ensure that that was taken care of, right? So I never said that we have to set up state schools or what have you. I said they're responsible for public education, which is not the same thing as saying that the state should run all the schools. They're responsible to ensure that the public is being educated. And I would say, insofar, and I said also, they're responsible to maintain the spheres of freedom that other institutions have, including schools. So let's stick with the education one. I don't like the language of competition in schools. I think it's the wrong way to think of education. I think there should be a diversity of approaches, and I think that the parents should be the leaders in terms of education. But the state still has a role in that. Maybe it is that somebody who's tremendously poor can't afford to send their kids there. I think there is a sense in which the state can and should provide funds for that. Now, is that the same thing as saying that the state should run all the schools as they are in this province in particular, which, by the way, is very out of step with the majority of the way the world works, but even in the developed world, Netherlands, Finland? No, it's not the same thing. But the state still does have a responsibility to ensure that. And I think on that we agree.
Yeah, we're really talking about execution and how it should be worked out. And I think, to Bill's point, to the extent that there is a dynamic Christian influence and presence, then the need for the state becomes much less. To the extent that that diminishes, you still need the regulatory framework and insurance. To the extent that we live in now in a very secular Ontario where you don't really have those feelings of responsibility, the state does grow and it becomes bigger and it does involve itself, and that has that's got its own challenges, right?
And here's the greatest challenge. It's not that I think you're right. I think if you look at Quebec, for instance, which has a heavy intervention of the state in many areas, you see a decline of charitable giving, and there's a sense in which the state funding is actually crowding out some of that giving. I would say that you're using the sword to do what should be an act of love, right? Which needs to be voluntary. So I think that's a real challenge. And I'm not saying that the state shouldn't provide welfare. I think there's a need for it to concern for that. But there's a sense in which if the state starts to take that on, the state runs programs, the state acts in a particular way. It has some very important tools. I don't want to diminish them, but the state is incapable of showing the type of love and human touch that occurs in a local community. And that's agreed on by many people who aren't Christians, whether it's a guy named James E. Scott or anybody who's ever been through the system understands that systems think in certain ways. It means that, Jonathan is social insurance number XYZ, right? And I am student ABC, rather than Brian Dijkema, a student with a particular past, and so on. And so the state is very good at lots of things and should be used, but it also has its limits. And when we talk about things like charity, we can provide, and I think we should provide, certain income protections. But ultimately, what does that mean? What does that mean? It means somebody has income, but it may mean that they don't have work. It may mean that they don't have the satisfaction, the health, the actual flourishing, which is what we should be concerned about, the human being. How does it help that human being to flourish? I don't think that's the same thing as seeing, somebody with CAP. Our church works with Christians Against Poverty, right, which is a debt agency that helps people emerge out of the slavery of debt. They also have a jobs program, and they work one-on-one with people. They don't see people as, file number X. They see them as like Jane, Anderson, right, or John Anderson. And that person's made in the image of God, and we want to help that person flourish. And I think that's what's lost. That's the key, and that's why I think there needs to be a partnership between certain state regulations and perhaps even funding, but the people closest to the people who are in need. That's where the action is. That's where I think Christians have the most to offer, and the track record actually shows. Christians are quite generous. They tend to spend a lot of money.
And what you've seen in our, more recently, I'd say, in Canada in general, North America, you can say in the States, is that through the growth in social services from the government, from the 60s on largely, they become their own bureaucracies within the government and become very inefficient, very ineffective, very depersonalized. And then they grow just for the sake of growing, and that of course puts a tremendous burden on the overall economy, and then there's increased taxation, deficits. So the government, again, we have to be very careful, and that's part of being citizens in Ontario, to keep the government in check and try to, again, get involved in that area of life and have Christians in government and Christians so that there isn't those abuses, because they become massive bureaucracies, which is what we see here in Ontario. The Ontario government is massive, bloated, ineffective, and inefficient in most of what it does. Right. And so it becomes, again, that burden to the overall economy and the ability to create wealth in this province, which would benefit everybody, including from the poorest on. So again, it's just, we got to be careful because of sin and the way it just continues to fester and to grow and create its own little empire.
I think this speaks to the issue of what level of government is most important. So here in Canada, we talk about the federal government and the provincial government and municipal governments. Where do you think most power should be administered, if I can use that word?
Well, I think that one of the things that we've gotten away from is the power of more local governments, and even provincial and local, having a lot more say in the administration of the society and the culture. That the further decisions in education, healthcare, local issues get centered in Ottawa, then the more depersonalized they get and the more bureaucratic and often more inefficient. So, I mean, it would depend on the function. If you need national defense, which is critical, that needs to be federal. So there's certain things that just have to be federal. Sure. To the extent you can push down some of the social services and some of the issues, I think it would be, in education, much, much better to be more local and to fund them locally and be more accountable locally, so that we can get involved. Here in Hamilton, you want to know what's going on, setting policy in Hamilton, not set, in Toronto if it's education, which then gets jammed down through the whole system. So I think, again, we need to really look at that. What is the most effective level of government based upon the programs and the issues that they're involved in?
Would you agree with that, Brian, that local government should be able to do as much as they can, and we just leave national issues basically to the federal government, like defense, but maybe think of investing more in municipal governments? And
yeah, I think Jonathan has pretty aptly described a principle that's held by Christians around the world, Roman Catholics, Protestants, a number of others, a principle called subsidiarity. And you've alluded to it, and you've described it quite well, which essentially says, let's not forget that there are some decisions that can't be made by local actors, right? We've talked about interprovincial trade or international trade agreements. The city of Hamilton shouldn't be leading the NAFTA discussions, right? Certainly should be part of it, but there's a sense in which what that principle effectively is saying is that the decision should be made by those to whom those closest to the outcomes or the action of or the sort of the effects of that decision. And you say that, you think of that even in terms of your own family or your own church, right? This is the Reformed polity is that way, But even with your own family, if a parent begins to make decisions for children that they really should be making themselves, you're actually failing, right, as a parent. And I would say that that's true as a state too, that if there's a local decision to be made about allocation of funding or what have you, that decision needs to be made by the people who are going to be affected by it. And that's true on education, it's true on economic life as well. A business decision should be made by the board or the management team of that business, not by an association per se or by a government. And that's I think a healthy thing. I think the challenge becomes where do those lines lie, right? And that's part of the democratic process as well. We haven't really talked too much about democracy, but that's the gift of democracy, is that we can debate where those lines should lie. And Jonathan and I can, national defense, absolutely. Federal, I don't want Ontario running our, all the bases are going to be in Ontario, and BC will be exposed, right, to our friends in Seattle. So you know what I mean by that. So,
and one of the issues is how we fund the government.
Right.
So this was one of the reasons why back before income tax was initiated 100 years ago or so, in a number of cases, they wanted to starve the federal government in the old days. In other words, keep it small, keep it focused on what it should be, to the extent that you put an income tax in and you now have this big sucking sound of money that coming from right across the country into Ottawa, in our country's case. Then they allocate the funds, and then they influence provincial and municipal affairs by their allocation of funds. And so we should be concerned about that as Christians. No, should we really be funding all that money to Ottawa and then getting it handed back to us in the provincial and municipal areas? I say, in many cases, no. Don't let the money go to Ottawa in the first place. Let them look after what they need to look after. Then we fund these things locally. To the extent that they hand it back out, it comes with all sorts of strings attached. We saw that, recently with the student employment issue with the federal government. And its basic bias and prejudice against Christians, and so we want to be, again, that's something we've got to really watch too.
Yeah, and it does mean then that maybe your municipal taxes go up, right? There's a sense in which, but there's an important point there, which is that it's easier to hold those who are closer to you to account, right? And that's an important part, because accounting for public spending is an important part of democratic government. It's an important part of the Western liberal tradition. Right, that no taxation without representation. There's the reason why the House of Commons has to, money votes are confidence votes. And it's much easier to hold your local government to account for spending than it is for a government that's further away, farther removed from you. But it would mean, and this is important to note, that you'd have to give the municipalities new tax powers. And so those are lots of open questions about how to do that. But,
Now, both of you are in touch with a lot of business people, and business people are often concerned about ways in which government regulations are impeding their businesses. Now, we've talked as Christians about the need to care for the world and to be stewards of creation. So doesn't it make sense for the government to have regulations on pollution, for instance?
No, absolutely. I think the issue in general, just stepping back a second, is regulations tend to have a ratchet effect. They go one way. And so they tend to just you pile them up. They just pile them higher and deeper, and you just get more and more regulations. I think to the extent that you were going to be trying to be efficient, you would be eliminating regulations as you don't need them anymore, and then you'd be making sure that the regulations you have are the ones that you need on the books to deal with the current issues in play. So, but typically happens is they pile on. So absolutely you need these regulations, but are they being set intelligently by the people that they're going to have the impact on, people who know it best? In many cases, again, the government often can become removed from the industry. You see this in Canada, I think, in the oil and gas industry. You've had a tremendous interference with that industry out of Ottawa in the last few years, and it's basically put a stranglehold on it. It's sucking capital out of one of the most important provinces, Alberta. So again, regulations, absolutely. Are they geared to what you were trying to accomplish at the end, or are they political or politicized, and do they become ideologically driven? And do they just keep piling higher and deeper? That's the problem we have with regulations in this country.
Jonathan makes a great point. I have a friend named Sean Spear who talks about what the need for regulatory budgeting. He says if you're going to introduce a new regulation, you have to get rid of an old one. And what that is effectively a way to try to systematize that need or that understanding that we shouldn't let all things pile up and impede that need not be there, right? He's not opposed to regulation. We absolutely need it. Ensuring that costs are paid so that, for instance, chemical companies or what have you aren't dumping their waste into our rivers, which are affecting all of us. Absolutely, we need that. But it needs to be done in such a way that it accomplishes an end that serves the public, right? And I think that's an important thing, not just serves particular interests within that, because that happens all the time. That regulations are often used in the interest of a particular party within an economy.
Well, you've done quite a bit of work on that in the whole bidding process.
Correct.
And the studies at CARDUS.
Correct, exactly. And so it needs to be publicly focused, right? So that the public can flourish as a whole, so that all businesses, all corporations are equally treated, can be, as you noted, are equally applied, right? That they're, and everybody knows the page that they're working on. And I think that's just very, very important for the flourishing of our sort of corporate life.
Sure. Canada has an extraordinary amount of household debt that's crippling the economy in many ways, and I suppose we could say Canadians learned it from the government, perhaps. But does it make any sense for the government to establish regulations that would prevent people from incurring as much debt as they do, perhaps on credit cards or something like that? Does that make any sense, or how can we?
Can I start on this one?
Oh, sure. You seem like you have something to say
I have
about
something
it.
to say. No. So the short answer is no. Government should not be regulating, the amount of times I use my credit card. So let me just say that for the record. Okay. And I say that as somebody who thinks that, as it says in Proverbs, the borrower is the slave of the lender.
Right.
Right. But let's remember what debt is. One person's debt is another person's asset, right? That's the way it works. You know how that works, Jonathan, right? And debt can be good or bad.
That's why we don't buy a lot of the banks anymore, because that bank's asset might not be worth as much as they think. Anyway.
Yeah, well, no, that's precisely it, right? Which gets into that question: is that asset? So I borrow for my wife and I have debt. It's in our house. It's our mortgage. It's good debt.
It's an appreciating asset.
It's an appreciating
as well,
asset,
yes.
right? And to that extent, and people can borrow, businesses can borrow, say they need new capital so they can be more productive. I know a buffalo farmer out west who needed to borrow to set up fences because he was setting up this new way, but his animals his herd would be way more productive with that. And so, the person he was borrowing from said, this is a good investment because I know it's going to produce more that can be used for food.
I can think of all kinds of good. I'm thinking about bad debt.
Okay.
People just not acting their wage, spending more than they should be.
It's a tremendous risk.
Yeah.
It's a tremendous risk personally because there is, Jonathan and I have talked about this on payday lending and things like that. You do become enslaved. You do become enslaved, and often if you're on consumer debt, which are things like couches, clothes, televisions, etc., cars,
yeah.
You are suddenly no longer working. You are working for the holder of that debt. That's where your increasing amounts of your paycheck are going to, and you have to ask yourself: Is that the type of slavery that comes by serving mammon? That sort of desire to be, have the nicest clothes, have the nicest. I think that's a sort of real instantiation of what slavery is, and that's why I think groups like CAP, Christians Against Poverty, are so important.
Right, and you're saying people who go into debt are kind of penalizing themselves. Is that the point? So government need not be involved with something like this. Leaving it free to people will ultimately bring about the kind of...
I think governments are very bad at determining whether debt is good or bad in the individual consumer's level.
I think they're incapable of doing that. If you look at the student loan situation in the United States, it's over $1 trillion student loan. It's actually more than that. Whatever the number is, it's a huge number. But actually, and this wouldn't be the whole problem with it. I mean, clearly people have lived beyond their means and they want to spend more money. But the government got involved after the financial crisis back in 2008, 2009, and they underwrote it all. And they've made it really easy to get access to credit. And so they're not very good at underwriting the risk, because at the end of the day, I think some of the political leaders think, well, we'll just write it off anyway. So it gets ideologically driven, in terms of the decision. The other thing is you pound all this, you make this debt available. it increases the price of schooling. So they bid up the price and the cost of education, which is ridiculous. So, so again, we have to be careful, and the government gets involved. It's not overly efficient in terms of market rates and underwriting the risks and things like that. I think the biggest issue in terms of the debt is how do we change people's hearts and attitude towards debt, materialism, taking a longer term view, delayed gratification. You'll have much more if you don't have the debt, as Brian's talked about in terms of borrowing at high costs. If you're a high risk, you're paying ridiculously high interest rates. You'll actually have more if you delay gratification and build equity along the way. If to the extent that you get enslaved to debt, you'll have a lot less, and you'll be under all this pressure, and of course you'll be living a life that is stressful and so forth, and it's not honoring to God. So for Christians, we want to be careful of the debt. We want to measure it well, think it through. There's good debt, but don't get involved in consumer debt that's just driven by short-term decisions and self-gratification. It'll kill you.
The Apostle Paul says, "Owe no one anything but love."
Yeah.
But let's go to payday loans, and maybe we'll conclude with this discussion, because I could look at this as an entrepreneur and say, there's free enterprise. I can establish a business. I can set the terms for how money's going to be loaned, and people are free to use my product or not. Comment on the phenomenon of payday loans.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a tough one. We've done a lot of work, research on that, and you can find them on CARDUS.ca and just look up payday loans. It's a tough question, right? Because people do need cash sometimes. People do run out of cash, particularly those in the lower income level. But again, this is where I think the Christian community should be unique. I think in the market, if we were to take an agnostic approach to the market and say markets are nothing but contracts, and contracts are not actually relational, then you say, oh yeah, that's just what the market's going to produce, and that's what the market can bear, and as long as it keeps under the state, set level of what the state says is over, that's fine. We could take that approach, but as Christians, it talks about lend without interest. It's routinely in both the Old and the New Testament. It talks about. So what are you doing when you're lending? So I'm thinking, if you're that entrepreneur and you're a Christian and you're thinking about setting that up, what are you actually doing here? Are you actually helping that person walk up the economic ladder, or are you just putting your foot on their throat, allowing them to breathe, and congratulating yourself for saying, look, they're breathing. Aren't I doing a great thing? No, what we should be focusing on is the type of work that Jonathan does, which is, advising people on what loans are good or bad, where should they invest in ways that are going to help them grow. And I think that often in the payday loan side, it's charging high rates to people because they have nowhere else to go. And so when I think of what the Christian community should do, it should be working to try to find new places for those people to go, whether it's the diaconate. Sometimes it's a matter of they need to borrow $300 to make the check or to buy groceries, or $100. Sometimes that's a diaconal role, right? The church should be asking, for instance, I think nobody in a church who's a Christian, a member of a Christian church, should ever take a payday loan. It should never happen. They should go to the diaconate first. That's the thing in Acts, where there should be no needy among them. If it's a problem of that person spending outside of their means and they're driving the Maserati, but they still need a payday loan, which happens, for the record, and lots of people have. Maybe it's time for their brothers and sisters in the congregation to say, look, we need to talk about that. Whether you're using your money for your glory and what type of thing it's doing to the church.
Well, thank you for that. That concludes another discussion on economics and politics with Jonathan Wellam and Brian Dijkema. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be continuing this conversation in a later episode.